Welcome to this EMS web training session. In this session, we're going to cover the EMS Data tab, which covers locations, practices, aspects, equipments, and permits. On some of those EMS data fields or items, you're going to be able to define the responsible party for that item. And so we're going to go through the process of being able to create responsible parties and how to link them to those pieces of EMS data. So within EMS Web, under the EMS tab, there is a EMS Data subtab, and within that EMS Data subtab are the locations, practices, aspects, equipment, and permits. Now, before we get started on how to enter all of that information into EMS Web, I want to relate a piece of advice that was given to me quite a number of years ago and has always stuck with me. It was in relation to data calls, and the advice was, before you collect any piece of information in a data call, make sure that you have a well-defined purpose for that piece of information. So you know in advance that you're going to use that piece of information in a report or for decision making or for some other reason. The one thing that you wanted to avoid was collecting data just for the sake of collecting data. And I think that same idea holds when putting data into a web system. Now, there's a lot of functionality with EMS Web, and not all of it is meant to be used. The functionality is there for the installation to use where it makes sense and where it's appropriate to make the job easier for the installation. So when you're putting in information in this EMS data section for the location, practices, aspects, equipment, and permits, that can be a huge amount of information depending upon what level of detail that you go into. And so before you commit yourself to that task, because once it goes into the system, you want to maintain it and make sure it's accurate over time. And that can be a costly undertaking for the future. So you want to ask yourself, what are you going to use this information for in EMS Web? So I can tell you some of the things that other installations are using this data for. For locations data, they might simply want a simple list of all of the environmental points of concern that they might use and might inspect over time. The practices and aspects, the most common use for that is for the annual ranking of your aspects and determining what your significant aspects are. One thing I will note is that most installations I have seen keep track of that type of information in Excel, and for the most part, it's much easier to update and maintain a large data set like that in Excel rather than having it in EMS Web. Now, EMS Web is perfectly capable of hosting all of that data, creating your worksheets, and ranking and scoring your aspects. However, if your installation has a pre-existing process of handling it within Excel, and that's worked for you well in the past, then there's not likely to be any time savings by trying to replicate that information in EMS Web. However, If you're just starting out, your installation doesn't have any aspect data written down yet, then you might want to start by putting it into EMS Web, where everyone has access to it. So there are advantages to putting that information in EMS Web. One of those is that you can tie some of this EMS data into your inspections. For example, if you're doing your internal Tier 2 inspections within EMS Web, then you can tie your checklists to individual locations or individual pieces of equipment or permits. And then it makes it very easy to do management issues like show me a piece of equipment and all of the inspections that have occurred. So as an example, I will take a look at a piece of equipment, a above ground storage tank. And that was tied to a Tier 2 inspection that they did and that they completed quarterly checklists for. So by going to this piece of equipment located under EMS Data, you have under related items the ability to look at here are all of the completed checklists. Here's the checklist templates that were used. If there are any findings that happen to that piece of equipment or related documents. So I'm going to right-click on each one of these hyperlinks and open it up in a new tab so we can take a look at all the information that's been centralized for this single AST. So you can see here's a list of all the completed checklists. You can see when it was completed and who audited it, if there were any comments entered. By clicking into the checklist, you can see what it looked like when it was completed and uploaded into EMS Web. So all of that historical information is available. So that's very handy if you want to show an inspector that wants to see what happened to this piece of equipment. For this particular piece of equipment, there's one finding, and you can see what that finding was, and then you can click on it and get all of the details of that finding. Similarly, if we go back to the equipment profile, we can see related documents. And so that gives you the ability to look at any attached documents for this piece of equipment. So in this example, there was a report that was made for this piece of equipment, and then they also uploaded some pictures. So if I click on it, I can download that picture. And, well, doesn't look like Google is going to let me open it up directly. So I'm going to download this picture and then open it up. And so here you can see that here's a picture of that piece of equipment. So if you're a new inspector and you're not quite sure, where the piece of equipment is, what it looks like, then you have a photo of it. And then, the second picture also shows some detail on it. Here's the exact label on that piece of equipment. So these are things that you can't do readily with a spreadsheet. And once that information gets into EMS Web, it's going to be saved there, and everybody at your installation has access to it. So if the person that was in charge of that equipment leaves, then the next person that comes in can easily pick up where that other person left off. And so you can do the same type of thing with locations and permits as well. So, if it's the case where you're not tracking any of your internal inspections and findings in EMS Web, then you may not want to populate in as much detail as you might otherwise want to. If you are running your inspections, your internal audits is getting to the level of, where you want to tie it to individual items, then you might want to put into EMS Web all of the potential locations, equipment, and permits that that the inspection might touch upon, because then it will be later over time, it will be much easier from a management point of view. So let's go back to Atlantis. We're going to go back to the EMS tab, and we're going to just quickly put in some EMS data data into the system. So under this location tab, you have the existing locations, and then we are going to make a new one. So we put in the building number or name. So this might be like the NEX building 135. And then you can put a more detailed description of this building. If you want it to, or the location name in the description, if you wanted to, you can put in something more appropriate, located at intersection of X and Y streets. One field that can be of considerable use to you is the responsible party. And we'll get into how to populate this drop-down menu at a later time in this session. But the idea is that you want to identify who is responsible for this location. Or if we're looking at equipment or practices, who's responsible for that. And then if later on, if you have findings, you might want to specify who the responsible party is for the resolution of that finding. Okay, so in this example, the location type was a building. You can specify an area as well. For example, if you have a runway, a drainage outlet, things like that that don't have specific numbers. And then you would just detail in the location name and description exactly what and where it is. So the location can be related to equipment and practices, as well as any checklists that were tied to it or documents. So in general, you want to create your practices first because in general, you want to create your locations first. So that's why it is listed first under EMS Data. Practices you can create next because practices always belong at a location. So for example, you're saying vehicle washing is occurring at this place where vehicle washing is the practice. Then you get into the aspects, and aspects are always tied to the practice. And equipment can be standalone. It doesn't have to be tied to anything else. Permits are the same way. But if you want to, you can tie the equipment to a location or a practice. So most often you tie the equipment to the building that it is located at. So for practices, we're going to create a new practice. The only mandatory field is the practice type and the practice name. So the practice type is used for rolling up all of these practices together and being able to run higher level reports, at the region or Navy level. So if they want to see, where all of the practice types of a certain type is occurring, they can. So for example, if you select hazardous waste management and you select the arrow which indicates there are additional ones, you can define where all of your 90-day sites are, for example. So if I take that, and then you can put a more specific practice name on it. For example, this one is Building 135 90-day site. And if there were multiple 90-day sites at Building 135, you might want to even say, on the east side and specify where. And then you can put additional information. Okay, so once you create your basic practice, then you have to define where that practice is occurring at. So in the example I made, it was occurring at a single building, Building 135. So when I add a location to that practice, then I can say, look up my building. So it's occurring at this NEX 135 that I created. And so I'm going to say that this practice occurs at this location. Some other mandatory fields are the budget submitting office. For all of you, it's probably going to be CNIC. In some cases, it might be BUMED or NAVFAC or NAVC. And then a mission tag as to, what mission this practice supports. So if it was a 90-day site, it might be supporting facilities management. Then who is the owner? So this would be the person, that's going to keep this information up to date. So I'm just going to put myself down for that. And then, as we talked about before, you can specify who a responsible party is for this practice. Okay, so then we see all the specific information for the practice that occurs at this building. And so if this was a more generic practice, you'd be able to associate it to multiple buildings. From the practice table, it shows you the higher level practice names, and then all of the locations that it occurs at. So you can see that air quality management occurs at these 5 locations. You have the option of looking at an expanded practice table, and what that's going to do is it's going to list off each individual practice name and practice and location that it belongs to. So each row then specifies a specific practice at a location. And then you can click onto that and go to that specific practice location pair. Just like the location, you can see everything that's related to this practice. So in this example, we have 2 pieces of equipment that's there. It's tied to 5 aspects and so on. And so you can click into each one of those and see all of the specifics. So we're going to move on to the aspects table and take a look at adding in a aspect. So we click on new aspect, and so just like practice, we have an aspect type. So that is a standardized list. So I'll say generation of hazardous waste. Again, you can put in a more specific aspect name. So if you have an aspect that doesn't fall neatly under the aspect type categories that are standardized, you can just pick the closest one and then write down what you're really looking for in that aspect under the aspect name. All aspects must be tied to a media. So in this case, it's obviously the hazardous waste media. And then you can pick the practice that it belongs to. So if I search for 135, then I'll get that practice that I just made that belonged to NEX Building 135. You can put a priority on it, high, medium, low, or P2, and you can mark if it's significant or not. Okay, so once you save that aspect, then you can click on the icon here. So if you left click on the icon next to the aspect name, you have the option of the significance worksheet. And the idea here is that you want to rank all of your aspects so you can find the highest ranking ones and make them significant aspects. And so we have a standardized significant worksheet that you can fill out. And so under this section, you have legal risk. You can say it's low, medium, high. And based upon what score you give it or what rating you give it, you get a score. Because, you know, each installation has different weightings for these ratings. Some of these items may be more of more importance than the other, and so you can fill out a multiplier for it. For example, you could say that this one is worth twice as much and put in a multiplier of 2. So then the idea is then you would go ahead, score your practice, and then at the end you would get a total score. So once you fill it out, you click the calculate button, and then it populates the total score with all of the fields that you populated. And then you can go through and say if it's significant or not. Now, this particular worksheet has been heavily modified by all of the test users, and they've been adding in additional types of ratings. And so when you go to your installation, you have the ability of changing what all of these rating fields are. And you can do that by going to the Worksheet Categories under EMS Data. And then you can see here are all the existing categories on that significance worksheets. So then you can open any of them up, and you can see what the category name is, what header it belongs to, and then you can give all the options that you want to score, like high, medium, and low, and then provide a score for each one. So you can customize it however you want in that manner. And so you can delete each worksheet category, or you can create new ones. And so once you alter the worksheet category, the next time you go and score a aspect, then it will use the updated significance worksheet with the new worksheet categories. So the intent then is you have all of your aspects, and then once you score them all, you can just click on the score header to sort them. So if I click on it twice, it'll score from high to low, and then you can then use your existing procedures to determine which ones are the significant aspects that you want. Okay, we have also equipment. And so what we've done is we've broken up the equipment into different types of classes. So we have general piece of equipment, we have water systems, storage tanks, and mechanical equipment. And the reason that we've done that is because we want to collect different types of information for these different equipment classes. So for example, a water system, you might want to know how many people does that water system serve, what kind of water system is it, and so on. So if we create a new piece of general equipment, you give it a name, and then you'll notice that mandatory fields are marked by a star. So we have a star after the equipment name because it's mandatory. But all of the other fields are non-mandatory. So if you wanted to, you could easily create a piece of equipment by just putting in the name and hitting save. But if you want to keep track of the other voluntary information, like you want to specify where that piece of equipment belongs. So if I say that this belongs at building 135, you have an equipment category, an equipment type. So, you know, if you're keeping track of all of your ASTs, then you can mark them all as the equipment type of AST, and then it's easy to find. Or the other way of doing it is you just embed the equipment type or any other important information into the equipment name. So you could say this is an AST 1,000 gallon. And so any information that you readily want to search by, one easy way of doing that is to embed it into the name of the equipment and just make it a practice to do so. So you have all of these different fields that you can relate to the piece of equipment. And do note that we can track latitude and longitude for GIS components. So once you create a general piece of equipment, EMS Web is thinking, but once it saves your piece of equipment, it's going to go to the equipment profile. Okay, I'm just going to, asking me for my pen. Okay, so So you can use the headers and sort by each of the categories from a piece of once you create a piece of equipment, you can convert it to any of the other types of equipment. And if you do so, it will just add in additional fields that you can then populate. So here is that general piece of equipment that we were looking at. And if I wanted to convert it to a storage tank, let's say, then it retains all of the general equipment, but now we have a whole host of other information that we can collect for this storage tank. And so then you can just click on Edit and fill out all of that information. If you convert it back to a general piece of equipment or another type of piece of equipment, then all of the storage tank specific information will be lost and only the general equipment information will be retained. So the last type of EMS data that we can look at are permits. And so I'm just going to open up an example permit. And so if I edit it, this is the same form that you would go to if you were adding in a new permit. So you can relate it to a piece of equipment. You can relate a permit to a practice. You can put in the permit number, permit name, requirement, any details of that permit, including the issuing agency when the permit expires, the registration number, et cetera, et cetera. So once you save the permit, you can see the related items here, and you can also create alerts. So one popular thing that an alert that you might want to create is to fire off an automated email before the permit expires so that you can start working on the renewal. Now, in this case, I only gave myself 5 days, but you can set it up for however many days is appropriate. So you can indicate how many, the unit, which are days, months, weeks, or even hours and minutes, before or after the permit either expires, is issued, or has a review date. You can make this alert fire off an automated email only if the status is one of the two values of current or expired, or if you leave it blank, it will go off under any status. You can specify that it goes to a specific EMS web user or more. You can select additional personnel by searching for it and adding it in with a check mark. So if I was looking to add it to the Atlantis auditor, I would check that as well, and then the alert would go to both of those people. And you can pre-write the automated email with the subject and the message. And so the email would look like it's coming from the EMS web system. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about are responsible parties. So this is the responsible party drop-down list for an installation is unique. Each installation can set up their responsible party list. When you begin, there are no responsible parties. You can create or edit existing responsible parties You can create a new one by clicking on New, give it a name. So example, training responsible party. And then what organization it belongs to. And then you can define POCs if you want. And the main reason for defining a POC is if you relate a responsible party to a finding, when that responsible party is assigned to a finding, then they will get a automated email, and that email goes to any POCs that you've defined for that responsible party. You can share the responsible party with your child organizations. So if you set up responsible parties at your region level, then all of your installation personnel will be able to use that responsible party as well. And so you can create as many responsible parties as you want. You can define POCs or not. And then once you've fully defined your responsible party list, all of those values will be available on the responsible party drop-down menu on the EMS items for location, practice, and equipment. And it's also going to be available under other areas such as findings.